Good afternoon. I'm Ben Freeman, the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Amongst many other issue areas, my team spends a lot of time investigating foreign influence in America. And that's why I'm delighted today to have Casey Michel with us. Casey is an author, journalist, and director of the Combating Kleptocracy program with the Human Rights Foundation. His first book, American Kleptocracy, seated over his shoulder there, was named by The Economist as one of the best books to read to understand financial crime. His writing on offshoring, foreign lobbying, authoritarianism, and illicit wealth has appeared in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, the Washington Post, you name it. Casey has probably published there. And he doesn't just publish, he's appeared on BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and just recently, he was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. So I've got some big shoes to fill as an interviewer here. But most importantly for today's discussion, he is the author of the just released book, Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World, which is also seated over his shoulder there. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Ben, thank you so much for having me. I should say, in addition to that generous plug for all of my work, hopefully folks will pick up a copy of Foreign Agents itself, because there is some material in there on Ben, yourself, and the incredible work you have done in the foreign lobbying space, in the research space. One of the very few who was in this so early. So, if folks need another reason to read the book, Ben is in there.
We're gonna. I got some questions about this Ben Freeman character in the book. We're gonna come back to him, Casey. But where I really want to start with you is, I'm a foreign lobbying nerd myself, as you mentioned there, and yet, I read your book and I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned right from the beginning of your book, and that's where I want to start, is about this character Ivy Lee, or who got a nickname from, of all people, Upton Sinclair gave him this nickname of Poison Ivy. So can you tell us a little bit, who was Poison Ivy and why is he so critical for understanding foreign agents in America?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say, first things first, as a Batman fan, I'm always happy when someone in one of my books has the same nickname as a Batman villain, Poison Ivy right there. Ivy Lee, for folks who may have heard of him, who may remember who he is considered the father of the public relations industry. And that's rightfully so. He operated in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century and kind of created the playbook for modern public relations as we understand it. He invented the first press release to send to journalists and editors. He really kind of invented the first crisis management playbook for corporate tycoons or political figures that were in some scandal they wanted to whitewash or get to the other side of. He really created what we now understand as the public relations industry and all the different manifestations that are in there. So even though we've had a century since he was operating, many of those parameters, many of those pillars of the PR industry are still one and the same. He was incredibly successful. I mean, he made the modern equivalent of millions and millions of dollars for himself and for his firm, which he ended up growing. In the United States, he really had kind of a pick of who's who for his clients. He worked with Woodrow Wilson. He worked with Charles Schwab. He worked most especially with the Rockefeller family to craft their images, to help them get past scandals and help them, of course, succeed. And in that success, he opened up the floodgates for other people, and most pertinently for this book and this conversation today, other governments who wanted his services as well, not just in the United States of America. He was also, so he's considered the father of the public relations industry, but as I argue in the book, he should also be considered the father of the foreign lobbying industry itself. Of course, the book has far more details about this, but as a little bit of a spoiler, he ended up working in Rome with Benito Mussolini. He ended up traveling to Moscow to have high-ranking meetings or high-level meetings with high-ranking Soviets, provide his advice there, and then most notoriously working with the German government, the Nazi regime in Berlin, and again, dispensing advice, offering his playbook to them, and then all of that eventually blowing up in his face but that playbook still remaining with us. Here we are almost a century later.
Right. I was fascinated about that experience with Nazi Germany. And, it's basically in the lead up to World War II. He's working with almost all the bad guys. And, just across the board, it's a who's who of bad guys in World War II that Ivy League works with.
Yeah, this is again another through line, Ben, which you have seen and done such in-depth work on yourself. Another through line from the era of Ivy League to where we are right now. It is that these notions of, or these differences of ideological preferences or political outlooks, they may exist in certain areas, right? They may exist in terms of certain policies, but when it comes down to identifying and signing up authoritarian or even totalitarian clients, those kind of ideological underpinnings, whether they're fascist, whether they're communist, those don't really matter to these Americans, these American firms and figures that are representing them. And certainly Ivy Lee encapsulated that. Again, he's working with the very first fascists that exist in Europe with Mussolini. He's working with the centerpiece of modern communism in the Soviets. And then, of course, he's in Berlin right after Adolf Hitler takes power and advising him on how to navigate the halls of power in Washington and target American populations along the way. So it cuts across the ideological spectrum because, again, at the end of the day, there is so much money to be made from these regimes.
Right. Absolutely right. I'm often fond of saying there's nobody so reprehensible, so despicable, so bad that somebody wouldn't lobby on their behalf. I've yet to find that person. I'd be willing to bet somebody a shiny $20 bill that person doesn't exist.
There's a quote in the book. I don't remember who said it, but something to the effect of, I would sign up to represent the devil if he was willing. It's not political, it's just business. And look, certainly as I've ever found it, there's no bottom to this industry, which I think bears itself out, unfortunately, year after year.
Right. That actually takes me into another question that I wanted to ask you about, and it gets to the sort of First Amendment issues with foreign agents and into the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because what you talk about extensively in the book, and really which these characters lead right into. When Ivy Lee is first operating there, when he's meeting with Mussolini, when he's meeting with Nazi Germany, there is no FARA. There's really, very little governing these interactions and this foreign influence in the U.S. at all. We have the Espionage Act. We have scant laws, but nothing to really disclose what's going on here. And so, really, Ivy Lee sort of sets the stage for FARA by working with Nazi Germany. Fortunately, folks in the U.S. took notice that you have Nazi propagandists, running all over the U.S. They're going. I mean, it was a real, original astroturfing campaign. They were, Nazi propagandists were spread out all over the U.S. I have photos of them in little parades and midtown America. You have Nazi flags flying right next to U.S. flags. A lot of that was brought about through Ivy Lee's advice and through some of these Nazi propagandas. Fortunately, folks in Congress got wind of it. And so we get to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and I would love to ask you about that generally, but I want to educate folks a little bit on what FARA is and isn't, because there's some concerns about FARA censoring speech, that sort of thing. But we know FARA, there's no prohibition. You can under FARA is a transparency statute. So I'd love to hear you kind of speak about that. How FARA came to be, and where you see FARA today.
Sure. Great questions, and of course, great context for all of this. I think pulling back for a moment, one of the things that I've found in writing this book and in other similar conversations like this is that a lot of folks don't realize, don't remember that lobbying itself in the American context, that's a constitutionally protected right. You have the right as an American, right there in the First Amendment, the right to petition your government for redress of grievances, which is just kind of an old-timey, old-fashioned way of saying you can go to your local legislator, you can go to your senator, you can even go to the White House itself to advocate for or to lobby on behalf of whatever cause you would like. I mean, again, the book gets into some of this history, but the earliest instances and evidence of lobbying go all the way back to the 1790s when Revolutionary War veterans were trying to get back pay. Lobbying is as American as baseball or apple pie or college football or whatever the metaphor may be. So, there's a very real constitutional protection for this. But then you see where figures like Ivy Lee and so many of these foreign lobbyists who have come since, you see what they realize, and you see what services they provide to foreign regimes, foreign dictators, foreign autocrats, and foreign oligarchs. And you realize that they are taking those constitutional protections and providing them for these dictator clients abroad. They are using and abusing these constitutional protections, not for the benefit of themselves or other American clients, but for the benefits of these regimes, which makes this issue of foreign lobbying such a difficult one to disentangle, such a difficult one to approach from a regulatory perspective, and such a difficult one to find a solution such as it exists. But the one thing that you mentioned, Ben, which again, you've done such great work on both at Quincy and obviously before, is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is where the book gets its name, Foreign Agents. This was a statute that was first passed in 1938 in the more or less immediate aftermath of Ivy Lee's work on behalf of the Nazis and so many others spilling out into the public space, and Americans writ large realizing that foreign regimes are more than happy to target American populations and American legislators, and in so doing shift American policy, both domestic and foreign, in the process. And what American legislators realized is, again, you can't ban this practice. You can't take a cudgel to these constitutional protections, even though I'm sure plenty would like to do so, but you can pass transparency requirements. And that is exactly what the Foreign Agents Registration Act does. In a very real nutshell, it requires foreign lobbyists not to stop doing what they're doing, not to even turn away these kind of dictator clients they've been working with, but to simply disclose what they are doing and who they are doing it for and how much money they are making along the way. Now, it's gone through multiple iterations. There are multiple amendments. In the decades since, it's been, almost 90 years at this point of FARA on the books. As Ben, you well know, and as folks will see in the book, it was effectively forgotten or overlooked, turned into a backwater for decades afterward. And it wasn't until the past decade or so when legislators and investigators finally started paying attention and even enforcing it. But the legislation itself is one of the kind of main characters in my book, because it was and remains this incredibly pro-transparent, even progressive piece of regulation that provided insight and, of course, and again, transparency into what these lobbying networks were doing. It's just a matter of enforcing it and making sure that all the regulations are actually being followed.
Right. And that's such a good point about the history of FARA. It's gone through these just crazy ebbs and flows in terms of enforcement. There was a 50-year period there before the recent 10-year period, and there had been a huge upsurge in FARA enforcement and prosecutions and convictions, frankly. But the 50 years before that, there were, I believe, 7 indictments in 50 years. So you're talking about, using the statute once roughly every 7 years, which is just an extraordinary lack of use.
If I can cite just a few statistics that are on the very first page of this book, before 2016, again, which is really when things like enforcement and investigations kick in, the staff overseeing in the Department of Justice, staff overseeing foreign lobbying disclosure requirements dropped by nearly half. The decline in inspections and audits of foreign lobbyists dropped by nearly 90%. And this, according to the first page of this book, yes, only a small handful of convictions in the half century leading up to 2016. Again, an afterthought, a backwater.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal how it's come back. We'll come back to FARA again and talk about sort of where FARA is at in the present day. I want to talk about a little bit more about Ivy Lee. Oh, and I'm remiss. I see some folks, I forgot to mention this, as in all QI webinars to our audience. This is a participatory sport. We want to hear from you. We've got a Q&A button at the bottom. If you have any questions, we are going to turn to Q&A a little later after Casey and I kind of nerd out for a little bit. So please put all your questions in there, and we'll try to answer as many as we possibly can a little later in the show. But Casey, going back to Ivy Lee, I see so many through lines between what Ivy Lee was doing and what we still see today. He had this basic playbook, which you point out. He wasn't, when he would advise clients, it wasn't to run away from public opinion. It wasn't, to kind of stick their head in the sand and hide. Quite the contrary. His playbook was to court the press, was to establish relationships with journalists, feed them inside info, push them to write stories in his client's favor, or might be disparaging about one of the client's enemies, somebody, an adversary of the client. He worked in lockstep with a number of journalists. And the fascinating thing to me is I was reading your book simultaneously as I was reading another book, All the Worst Humans by Phil Elwood, who was previously, he was an operator in this space. He was a modern day Ivy Lee, if you will. And reading through his book, this is what he did. In the 21st century, he used this, almost exact same playbook that Ivy Lee did. But what we see now in different times of using this playbook is that the equation has changed. In Ivy Lee's time, there were journalists everywhere. There were very few of these, PR claques, kind of the Ivy Lee types. Now that relationship is completely flipped. It's by, statistics vary, but public relations specialists now outnumber actual journalist writers by at least 2 to 1, by some estimates, 4 or 5 to 1. That's a long monologue, but what I really want to hear from you is, what does that mean for the influence industry? What does that mean for journalism? That we know these PR pros, we see it in FARA filings. They're just feeding journalists all of this information. What do you make of that?
Well, look, it's that many more headwinds that journalists that are trying to uncover the truth, trying to maybe even expose some of these networks, let alone what critics of these regimes are trying to do, or democratizing forces elsewhere are trying to do. It just makes it that much more difficult. I suppose, to play devil's advocate, everyone knows that the journalism industry is on, it's fallen on hard times. Why would a young up-and-coming writer or someone interested in, geopolitics or policy itself, why would they become a journalist rather than go into the PR space where, again, Ben, as you and others have done such great work on, there is so much money sloshing around. And again, not only from domestic benefactors or domestic patrons, but from especially the foreign governments, the foreign regimes, the foreign companies, the foreign oligarchs, effectively bottomless pits of money. One of the reasons that the foreign lobbying industry, has brought in billions of dollars over the past, 8-9 years, whatever it might be. Ben, I think it was your work previously that I wish I don't have the number in front of me. It was something like 25 or 30% of all wealth now spent on lobbyists is from foreign sources themselves.
Right. Yeah. $1 in $4, approximately $1 in $4 is
again, which is staggering, not only because of what that represents, but also, there is plenty of concern. There are plenty of books, plenty of exposés on the domestic lobbying side, which makes, the lack of relative work or focus, you and me aside and a few others aside, Ben, that much more surprising on the foreign lobbying side. I don't have anything necessarily unique to say about what the fact that PR representatives now outnumber journalists might say, other than that is a fertile field for foreign dictators, foreign regimes, foreign governments writ large to tap into to access their own slice of the American foreign lobbying pie.
Right, 100%. When you look at the sort of basic economics of it, as you're pointing out, if you're a journalist, your job's in jeopardy a lot of times, or you're bouncing around. Maybe you're not getting paid too well. Then one of these lobbying PR firms comes along and says, "Hey, we'll hire you." Talk to some folks who've literally had their salaries doubled overnight. By crossing over. And it's interesting. You in your book, you sort of talk about your own personal. You've been writing for a while. You've been an investigative journalist. You've done some of this, and you had if we could give a little bit of a spoiler from some content that's in the book. I'm just fascinated by the exchange you had with this red carpet trip to Baku that you were offered. So if you wouldn't mind spoiling a little bit from the book, can you tell folks about that experience you had there?
Well, Ben, actually, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but this is, for me, kind of when I first got interested in this space and in understanding the world of foreign lobbying or researching it. Never thought I'd write a book about it, but here we are. This was back in the early 2010s. I was working as a very poor, very broke journalist in beautiful Houston, Texas. I was doing a very soft story on a local Azerbaijan cultural center. Houston, big oil town, big energy town, is sister cities with Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, big oil country. A hereditary dictatorship been in power there for decades. Horrible human rights abuses. Very much the model of kleptocratic governance in the 21st century. Again, it was a very soft story. What is Azerbaijan? Where is it? Why should we care? So on and so forth. At the end of this, we're making some Azerbaijan dumplings. We had a wonderful day, and my tour guide there, she kind of takes me to the side at the end. And she says, "Look, in a couple weeks, we're organizing a big congressional junket to go out to Azerbaijan. It's going to be the biggest one the U.S. has ever seen. Something like 12 or 15 members of Congress are all flying over. The biggest trip that the Caucasus has ever seen from American legislators." And she says, "We think it would be great if you were there." And I say, "Yeah, sure. I agree. It would be great." She says, "Look, we'd love to have you come. What if we pay for your flights, your hotels, and we'll put you up when you're over there?" I say, "Boy, it's a pretty nice offer. That's especially for someone who has single digits in his bank account." And she says, "Okay, well, that's great. There's just one thing we want to ask of you. Just don't write anything negative about Azerbaijan, about our country." She doesn't say it, but again, about the decades-long dictator that's now in power, that's been in power. And I say, "Boy, wish I could do that. Can't make that agreement. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to decline." That was my kind of origin story. Gets into there's two codas to that I wanted to mention, to flag. One, I regret not going, trying to pay my own way for multiple reasons. But one primary one is because this ended up exploding into a relatively significant scandal in Congress, one of the biggest, certainly in 21st century history, at least previous to 2016, when it came out that Azerbaijan was, of course, secretly bankrolling these legislators using nonprofit cutouts in Texas to pose as the ones actually funding it, when in reality it was the Azerbaijan dictatorship and its related state oil company. That's one element that I regret not going for. The other element that I thought was interesting, and unfortunately was too recent to make it into the book itself, was there was a series of charges that just came out a few months ago against Representative Henry Cuellar, also from the great state of Texas, a Democratic member of the House of Representatives, for acting as a foreign agent for the government of Azerbaijan. And the woman who was acting as his kind of effective handler, who just pleaded guilty a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago now, to foreign agents related charges, was the same woman that invited me all those years ago on this trip to Azerbaijan. So it can be a very small world at times, but yeah, what a memory.
So many questions arise from that, but one of them, I think, is the timeline that can go into FARA investigations. And as I think I will ask you about our industry, foreign influence research, a little bit later, but consider that timeline there. You're talking more than a decade later, after, where you actually see an indictment, where you actually see a guilty plea in a conviction. The timeline on these can just be extraordinary, and even the Henry Cuellar's indictment, that too, all of that happened, years and years and years ago. So these investigations can they can be a long time cooking, and so a lot of what's going on in the foreign influence industry, it could be happening right now. It could be incredibly shady, and we won't find out about it for years and years and years to come.
100%. Of course, for plenty of legal reasons, these things take time, but also for investigative resources or even general interest out of the Department of Justice or elsewhere. Absolutely, these take years. And I'm reminded, it's within the orbit of foreign influence, foreign lobbying, and foreign interference. There was a story in the Washington Post earlier this month that certainly, by all appearances and by all available evidence, it certainly looks like the military dictatorship in Egypt may well have funneled $10 million to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. The money was missing from an Egyptian bank. We had intel indicating this was happening. Suddenly, Trump injects $10 million of what he claims is his own money into the campaign. The investigation goes nowhere. The administration eventually shuts it down. But that was, what, 8 years ago that we're talking about now? We're just now learning about that. And of course, that didn't even come with any charges. So I'm just echoing what you said at this point, Ben. It takes a long time.
No, you're exactly right. I want to, that brings up another question I wanted to ask you about the sort of other avenues, outside of lobbying and public relations, where foreign money can get into the U.S. political process and have some influence. And the one I really want to ask you about, it comes up from your experience with the folks in Azerbaijan. And I'm remiss for not mentioning that the Quincy Institute, we put out a brief on Azerbaijan's lobbying and influence late last year with my wonderful colleague, our team. Please check that out on the Quincy website. In there, we talk about Azerbaijan's use of nonprofits and think tanks to garner influence. And I'll give a shameless plug to another Quincy product that'll be coming out in the next couple of months. We are putting out a giant database of think tank funding. It's going to be the first publicly available, searchable database where you can see where all the foreign money, government money, is coming into all the think tanks across the U.S. We'll have a report to accompany that too. Your book goes into this issue in great depth, Casey. So I would love if you could just talk about how foreign influence is impacting think tanks, and where do you see that why are they doing that?
Sure. Ben, I feel a little bit silly telling you this because you have literally done more work in this space than anyone, at least in the United States of America. There's a reason I cite you multiple times in the book itself. And I cannot wait for that database to go live. I cannot wait to take a look. I mean, the 10,000-foot reason for why foreign regimes target think tanks for donations, for formal partnerships, for hosting scholars from these think tanks, is because in the American policymaking community, kind of how the sausage is actually made of American foreign policy. It's not just the legislators themselves sitting around with staff members and coming up with the best foreign policy, or even thinking about things like grand strategy. There is a whole world, there's a whole universe, a whole nexus of think tanks in and around Washington, D.C. that are constantly hosting events, hosting conferences, and especially issuing white papers on what American foreign policy or American domestic policy should be in specific cases, in specific spaces. And for legislators that are strapped for time, energy, and resources, those white papers can absolutely be a godsend for certain policy decisions. It makes things very, very easy for them. Think tanks are a key and increasingly, unfortunately, overlooked element of American policymaking writ large. That's one of the kind of macro reasons foreign governments would target think tanks with significant funding and have done for years. The other element, on a more maybe technical level, is that think tanks, like so many other nonprofits in the U.S., don't have to, at least as of yet, register with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They don't have to disclose what they are doing or who they are working with, or maybe what they're doing in terms of certain payments from certain regimes, let alone how much money they're actually taking in. It is a complete black box of financing that does not have to comply with even the bare bones registration, bare bones disclosure requirements that other American lobbyists have to use and have to follow. I mean, it's kind of this kind of perfect creation if you want to affect policy without anyone having any idea what you're doing, which is why we see dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship, in addition to a number of other democratic governments, targeting the who's who of the American think tank community, the Atlantic Councils, the Brookings Institutions, the Aspen Institutes, increasingly places like the Heritage Foundation as well, from regime after regime after regime, from Azerbaijan, to mention one, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Hungary, so on and so on and so on, in addition to places like Canada, the United Kingdom, Norway, and others. It's a phenomenon, Ben, you have done more work than anyone to shine a light on. It is a phenomenon that is woefully overlooked. And we have seen, unfortunately, very little progress on in recent years, despite a number of recent scandals in this space.
Right. And it's been in the news, as you said, too. I recall just a few weeks ago, there was media reports coming out about the Israeli government that was considering using think tanks as a way to get around fairer registration requirements. That was the allegation, at least. And I was sort of reading that story probably as you were. I was like, this is the least surprising thing I've read today. I think it's very well known that there is this sort of think tank loophole. And we do see some think tanks register. This has come up a little bit. In some cases, a think tank here or there has registered. But by and large, most think tanks at least believe that they are covered under this exemption for scholastic activities. Bona fide scholastic activities is the way the statute reads. But my colleague Eli Clifton and I have done considerable work in this, and we think there's reason to question whether some of these think tanks are really engaging in scholastic activity when they're doing some of this work with foreign governments. And so I think this is an area going forward where Congress really has to step in, because the FARA unit, the Department of Justice, is really hamstrung on this by this kind of vague statute, and it's really not clear when it comes to think tanks. You need Congress to step in. And I think a very easy first step, as you also recommend in the book, the Fighting Foreign Influence Act, wonderful piece of legislation that includes, at a very, very basic level, Congress should mandate that think tanks have to disclose their foreign government funding. Right now, this might shock a lot of our listeners to realize that think tanks who literally, let's go through what think tanks do. They testify before Congress. They write talking points for hearings. They even write legislation. They literally are writing the laws of the land, and yet they do not have to disclose when they get money from foreign governments. It's pretty unbelievable when you think about the impact they can have. And we know that these donors are having influence on think tanks, and yet they don't even have to disclose it. Just phenomenal to me, Casey. Sorry for another monologue.
No, of course.
With a question, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, just at the very basic level, can we get think tank funding just to be publicly released?
Look, I would love to. I mean, I think there's a couple key points within that, Ben, right? One, no one's proposing that this is made illegal or that think tanks can't accept this money. Again, similar to the foreign lobbying industry as it's currently understood, it's not illegal. It's just transparency. It's just understanding where this money is coming from. Right now, as far as I'm aware, and Ben, you're more steeped in this than I am, some think tanks disclose some of the information about some of their foreign patrons. I'm thinking of organizations like the Atlantic Council, which is, it discloses publicly some of its significant donors. One of those, at last checked in the highest tier of donations, was the United Arab Emirates, which, as the Atlantic Council says, donates at least $1 million, or did so last year. I don't know. I mean, that's fine, but is it 1 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 20 million? I have absolutely no idea, and no one else has any idea. Or I'm reminded of things like the Brookings Institution, which was the subject of a number of high-profile investigations a while ago, taking, as far as anyone could tell, money from only one foreign source, and that was the government in Qatar, which, as some of the scholars there said, resulted in Qatar and the regime there being an effective no-go zone in terms of criticism or research at the Brookings Institution. Again, these aren't no-name institutes. These are the who's who of the think tank world that have gotten away for years without having to disclose even bare bones information about their foreign benefactors.
Right. I'll spill another beans about our forthcoming database and report. Exactly to your point, more than a third of the top think tanks in the U.S. disclose absolutely no donor information. And again,
that is a wild statistic. Ben, one quick question for you. My general understanding is that the think tank, again, if you go back to the early 20th century, yes, Brookings was there, but I don't know any other think tanks that are at least still with us that were there in the early 20th century. My impression is that the think tank industry, if we can call it that, has only continued growing in recent years, both in terms of stature, but also, of course, importance in terms of policymaking.
I think that's exactly. I can't believe the tables have turned. I've completely lost control of the interview. I'm taking
my plan all along.
No, but you're exactly right. The industry is gigantic. There are more than 1,000 what are considered think tanks in the U.S. and some cover sort of niche areas, an issue here and there, but more operating like special interest. But many of them are these sort of large behemoths. The Brookings Institution, for example, has a budget that's almost $100 million a year. These are gigantic enterprises these days. So the industry has exploded, and the funding models of think tanks have radically changed from those early days to include much more reliance on special interests, and of course to your point, this discussion of foreign governments.
Yeah, I for again, I guess context sake or clarity's sake, or just for the sake of putting everything about Brookings on the table, one of their spokespeople did get back to me some number of months ago and said they do no longer take money from Qatar. I don't know if that means they take money from other foreign regimes or foreign governments. I don't recall off the top of my head. Again, but that is only one instance, one case study of all of these other dozens and dozens, or I guess hundreds and hundreds of other think tanks, many of which still don't disclose anything about their foreign benefactors.
That's exactly right. I see the Q&A just piling up, and there's some incredible questions, and I'm gonna keep them coming, y'all. But before we go there, Casey, I have to ask you this. We got to talk about this this Ben Freeman character in your book. And in your book, Casey, I'm going to quote here. I am described as, quote, someone you might mistake for a cross-country runner, or maybe even a professional lacrosse player. Casey, I read that line. I have to confess to you, I had absolutely no idea that was a career option. Professional lacrosse player. But then I'm reconsidering all my life choices. Do you have contacts in this league? How do I get in?
I'm from Portland, Oregon originally, and I remember the Portland Lumberjacks professional lacrosse team. I don't know if they're still around or if they've moved elsewhere, but I know that they exist. Ben, this was the beauties and perils of writing a book is the color that you are encouraged to include for some of the characters that are mentioned in there. This was my roundabout way of saying you've always seemed like you're in very good shape. And much as I try, I'm not there yet. But it's also another way of saying you might be mistaken for one thing, but in reality, again, without blowing too much smoke, you are one of the people that was in this space, if not the only ones in this space before 2016, certainly before I was. And again, all cards on the table. This book, or at least much of this book, would not have been written without your work for years on things like think tanks, on things like the role that lobbying firms play in terms of routing foreign donations into political campaigns themselves and circumventing American campaign financing rules and regulations. Again, as I think you and I have talked about previously, I imagine it was a very lonely world for a very long time. And you must have felt like you were just hitting your head against the wall and there was no progress or interest being made. And I just wanted to take this moment while everyone's on the call to remind folks that Ben was doing this before it was cool, before anyone else was really paying attention. And it's just one of those things, I tried to build on this, and hopefully future researchers will try to build on that. And, so it goes.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I literally call myself a foreign influence hipster, and I was worried about it before everybody even gave a hoot. I wrote this book over my shoulder, The Foreign Policy Auction. It was released in 2014, and frankly, I'm not sure my mom read it. It was just nobody cared. 10 years ago on this topic, nobody. Still available. Find it in your wherever books are sold. The topic has really come around now. But Casey, I want to get to a serious. I had to bring that up. But I want to get to a serious question about that. And you're one of the handful of people who, and myself, and a few others who are really steeped in FARA investigations. I want to ask you, where do you sort of see this field of foreign influence investigation, foreign influence research, journalism going? And then two, where do you see it going? What do you think we can do better in the future? I'm constantly berating myself. God, I wish I'd done this, or I wish I'd done, or what if we could do that? What are those things for you about what we can do better?
So great questions both. Again, Ben, you've been in the space longer than I have. Even though it has grown, it can still feel lonely, and certainly I would love to have more and more eyeballs, more and more folks interested in. But Ben, I'm sure you felt the same way. It has been at times shocking to see just how much interest there now is. I guess in the general public, maybe from legislators themselves, of at least foreign influence, maybe foreign interference. And within that, foreign lobbying campaigns themselves. Of course, still not nearly enough interest or resources or focus, let alone legislative fixes. But in large part because of 2016 and in large part because of Donald Trump's presidency, I do think there's kind of a general awareness that, hey, maybe foreign regimes are trying to target Americans and trying to shift American policy as they see fit. Of course, not limited to Russia. but you can toss in any of the dozens of other countries and regimes that have financial entanglements with Trump. That is just one small speck in a far larger image of what modern foreign influence and foreign lobbying is. I suspect, who knows what the future holds. What did Yogi Berra say? That the prediction is hard, especially about the future. I don't know where things are going. I suspect with Trump still in the kind of spotlight in terms of the American politics, we will still see continued interest in this space. I have been pleasantly surprised by the Department of Justice's recent charges against a number of high-ranking American officials, both out of Congress as well as former White House National Security Council staffers. We just mentioned Henry Cuellar a moment ago, but just a few weeks ago, we saw the very first conviction in American history and almost 250 years of this American republic, the very first conviction on foreign agents-related charges against a member of Congress, Senator Bob Menendez from the great state of New Jersey, who wasn't, again, a no-name backbencher, but was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. If DOJ is willing to go after a figure like that, then I am, I suppose, optimistic that we will see similar prosecutions moving forward. As it pertains to where we can go on the research side, I mean, we have to keep beating the drum. We have to keep highlighting the database you mentioned that's coming out, Ben. That is going to be a phenomenal resource, both internally, but maybe especially externally. It is encouraging other researchers. It is encouraging other academics. And maybe this is things like building bridges between journalists and researchers and academics, similar to what we have seen in the international, transnational money laundering space, to provide further insights and even policy fixes there. Maybe it does come down to building bridges with new communities that we have perhaps seen as either disinterested or different from the research space that you and I have been operating in for years at this point. You know, I've been around long enough to realize that few things move American policy solutions like national security concerns. Certainly that's been the case for the transnational money laundering side, the kleptocracy side, which I was working in for my first book. It was concerns about things like Russian oligarchs, Chinese money laundering, so on and so forth, that really got the policy fixes that we wanted. I suspect on the policy side, that's what it's going to require for things like foreign lobbying, oversight, reform. But it doesn't have to be the only area. Anyways, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer whatsoever, but I'm happy to be in this fight with you.
Yeah, we need you. I think, frankly, a quick comment on that. We need more people in the fight. I could not agree with you more. You know, our very small team here at the Quincy Institute, you know, we feel like we're drinking from the a fire hose on this issue. There's more to possibly cover and investigate in this field than we could ever hope to. And so a big part, you mentioned the think tank funding database, our big hope with that is to get all this information out there, make it publicly available. So whether you're a journalist, you're an academic, or you're a concerned member of the public, you know, I see a lot of wonderful questions in the Q&A about, you know, who are the top spenders and that sort of thing. We want to put that all out there so we can just give you that information. We can aid those investigations as much as we possibly can. Yeah. And another hopeful sign to me is that we're seeing more academic work on this. We had a webinar maybe 2 months ago with a professor from Harvard, and they are committing big resources to taking a hard look at the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They're going back decades, and they're ultimately going to create a giant database of all the political activities reported under FARA ever. Yeah. So it's going to just this extra, and they're going to make it publicly available eventually too. So with all this in between that, you know, what Open Secrets is doing with its Foreign Lobby Watch, making all that information publicly available. I think the more information we get out there, the wider tent of foreign influence researchers we can make, the better. That's my rant. I got to get to the Q&A because we have just some amazing questions here. And one of them actually peels right off of your comment, Casey. It was another recent case here. There's a question from John Limbert. It's about the Sumi Terry case. And John asked, for those who don't know, she's been charged under FARA related to some involvement with the South Korean intelligence services. And you know, John points out some distinguished legal scholars, including Larry Tribe, called the DOJ's case, quote, very shaky.
Mm.
What do you think? What do you make of this case? And do you think there have been many cases of the law being misused recently, John S.?
Sure. Great question. Obviously, still ongoing. Unfortunately, the indictment was just a few weeks ago at this point, so far too recent for me to include in the book itself. I'll refrain from commenting necessarily on the legal merits of it, other than to say that if DOJ is bringing forth a fair prosecution for someone of this stature, then I would like to think that they have all their ducks in a row. And I will say, I've interacted with foreign officials. I've interacted maybe even with foreign intelligence officers. None of them have ever bought me $1,000 handbags in the past. And look, maybe I just don't strike them as someone who would like that, but who's to say? Which is one of the key elements of the prosecution against Sumi Terry. So fascinated to watch it play out. But again, I would like to think that if DOJ is going against someone of that stature, a former member of the White House National Security Council, again, after they already targeted, charged and convicted someone like Bob Menendez, someone like Henry Cuellar, if recent past is any history, it's going to be a successful case. Now, there have been, which the book goes into, fumblings on the prosecutorial side in relatively recent history, in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Even though we saw successful prosecutions of figures like Paul Manafort, or we saw guilty pleas of figures like Mike Flynn, there were a number of high-profile prosecutions on foreign lobbying-related charges that did not go prosecutors' way. Tom Barrack, the former foreign policy and economics advisor for President Trump, was charged, if I remember correctly, on FARA-related charges for working for the United Arab Emirates. A jury acquitted him. And Gregory Craig, who was the former Obama administration White House counsel, charged for being involved in Paul Manafort's network in Ukraine, was also acquitted. And if folks want to read through a recent article from a few weeks ago, Gregory Craig himself had an article defending Sumi Terry about why he thought the prosecution should not have been brought. I think maybe he's a little too close to the topic, or maybe that's the right place for an author to be. Who am I to say? It has not been an unblemished record for prosecutors. I certainly don't think they have, been using or abusing foreign lobbying regulations themselves, but they have not won all the cases they have put forth in recent years.
Right. I would very much agree with that analysis. And I think, too, when you look at what has happened with FARA lately, I think very much the FARA statute, it has become politicized. There's no doubt in my mind that people can use allegations of folks working as an unregistered foreign agent as a political weapon. No question. And, we've sort of seen this thrown, both sides of the aisle are throwing these accusations across at each other. Absolutely. It can be politicized. I personally think when I look at this specific case, I'm not sure that's what's going on here. As you read through the indictment, as I have, you see these $1,000 handbags changing hands. You see these Michelin-starred restaurants, dinners, and you see, coming out of a meeting with executive branch officials, giving your notes directly from that meeting to a foreign intelligence service. It's hard for me to look at that indictment and to think, as a think tanker myself, I look at that, and if I had done any number of those things, I would assume the FBI was going to be knocking on my door. And the interesting thing, the indictment also points out, the FBI had been knocking on her door, well before the formal charges were brought down. So there was sort of, they established there was sort of this awareness of the statute, awareness that the FBI was concerned, and yet the behavior kept going. To me, I would be worried if I had done any of that behavior.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, that was also the case with Steve Wynn, who was at one point Republican fundraising committee chair, was also charged with circumventing FARA-related or foreign lobbying-related regulations for working on behalf of the government in China, and had been warned multiple times about registering. Now, a judge ended up ruling in his favor because of statute of limitations concerns. But as I remember correctly, the order itself from the judge said, in effect, boy, I wish these statute of limitations hadn't been in existence, because this was a clear breach. And again, he had been warned time and time and time again, and yet still proceeded with his actions.
Right, right. I think that's often a misnomer too about fair prosecutions and fair enforcement. It is really hard to get a conviction for violating FARA. FARA, amongst many other things, FARA only includes criminal penalties. There's no civil fines under FARA. They can't give you a speeding ticket, and this is another issue for Congress. I think needs to address. There has to be some mid-level sort of punishment. Give somebody a speeding ticket for these minor infractions. And maybe that's an issue with the Sumi Terry case. This wasn't the case. It wasn't like a Menendez indictment. There's not gold bars. There's not like bags of cash. There's not luxury cars in this indictment. There's just luxury handbags. It's a small thing. So maybe that should be a speeding ticket. But for a criminal prosecution, a successful criminal prosecution of FARA, you have to prove not only that they did the thing, but there's a willfulness criteria. So you basically have to prove that not only did they know what, not only were they speeding, they knew exactly what the speed limit was, and then kept speeding. Right. That's effectively what they have to prove. Huge, high bar for prosecution. That's why many of these prosecutions, they don't make it, and a lot of folks who might otherwise be indicted don't get indicted because they're not convinced that they can hit that threshold.
One last thing to flag right there, though, Ben. We're talking about some of the recent prosecutions. Again, much of my book focuses on malign networks, dictatorships, autocrats, so on and so forth, and that's all fine and good, including many anti-American countries and regimes. But every one of the recent prosecutions, from Menendez with Egypt, from Cuellar with Azerbaijan, to Terry with South Korea, those are all close American partners. Those are all effectively American allies, again, that are using these lobbying networks or alleged lobbying networks for their own benefit. So just wanted to put that on the table as well.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. It reminds me of a wonderful question in the Q&A that's about America's enemies, our adversaries, and what we've seen recently. Another trend, in addition to this uptick in enforcement, we've seen more and more. FARA has this life abroad now, and I think we've seen good examples of FARA-like legislation start to appear in the UK. We've seen FITS, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme in Australia. I think used to good effect there. But then we also have plenty of examples of the bad side, this Russian foreign agent law, and of course the Hungarian foreign agents law that led to literally riots in the streets. And so Martin Bontersch in the Q&A asked, could you compare and contrast our foreign agents law with more recent foreign agents laws enacted in Russia and of course Hungary and these other places?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would toss Georgia in there as well as another case study of a regime, clearly anti-democratic regime, that is willing to use foreign agents related legislation or try to pass it in order to presumably target regime critics. Honestly, I think this is a great area for future research, whether at QI or other researchers themselves, to actually look through these specific statutes, what is similar and maybe most especially what is different. Because again, at the macro level, if you go back to the Russian imposition, the Russian passage of their foreign agents related legislation in the early 2010s, they pointed directly to the United States of America as their model. They said, if the U.S. can have legislation like this, why can't we? Now, I'm not going to profess to be an expert on the specific terminology in Russian. My Russian these days is very rusty. Get a couple drinks in me, I'll be a little bit better, but it's very, very rusty these days. But they pointed directly to the United States and saying, if you have it, then we should as well. Now, the kind of maybe unfortunate reality is any dictatorship, any authoritarian regime, any autocracy can pass any legislation that they want or next to any legislation that they want and point to an example in a democratic country as saying, you do this, so we're going to do this, and of course, abuse it and use it to target our regime enemies. But it has been very fascinating to watch. There's been increasing discussions, of course, Georgia, places like Kyrgyzstan are also now talking about having their own foreign agents related legislation. It has been wild to watch it kind of metastasize and see dictators realize, oh, we can do this to target our own domestic enemies as well. So might be a disappointing response. I don't really feel like I have the expertise in each specific national legislation, but it is a space that is not going away anytime soon.
Right. I actually think this is an area talking about what FARA nerds like us can do more of and a better job of. when a country is considering doing one of these schemes, weigh in. We can write an article. We did this for the UK scheme. My former colleague Taran Krishnakumar and I, we wrote a piece in Rusi where we were just hoping to say, like, if you guys are considering this, here's some lessons. I believe the piece is called "Lessons from Across the Pond." Please give it a read. We're very much trying to do that. But there's more countries and more of these schemes coming up than we could possibly address. So I think folks like us, we can weigh in. In FARA, as much as we've talked about, FARA is so far from perfect. It's like democracy. It's the best of the worst that we've tried.
Yes.
But it has its flaws. We'd love for other countries to do a better job than FARA going forward. But back to the Q&A, we have some wonderful comments from Minnie Kotler in the Q&A about think tanks, and Minnie points out Minnie's comments don't end with a question, but I want to bring them up. That she points out that in addition to everything we said about think tanks, that think tanks are perhaps the #1 source for congressional testimony. When Congress is looking for people to testify, they look directly to think tanks, and many cases. They're not revealing that what they're testifying about is an issue that's of direct relevance to the folks funding that think tank. She brings up Japan's funding of think tanks around DC. And again, another partner spending lavishly on think tanks and on influence, but really flying under the radar, perhaps because it's a U.S. ally.
Yeah. I mean, look, Mindy's exactly correct. I couldn't have said it better. There's one case study in the book that comes to mind. A woman named Brenda Schaefer, who was, maybe still is, at the Atlantic Council, but also no one was aware, moonlit as an advisor to the president of, again, Azerbaijan's state-run oil company. And all while she was doing this and not telling anyone, she was testifying in front of Congress on Azerbaijan. She was writing in the New York Times. She was writing in the Washington Post on how wonderful Azerbaijan is, or at least how much the U.S. should support them. No one had any idea about this relationship until Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, actually broke the story. And I mentioned that because that was another interaction I had. I'm going to butcher the quote, but I asked her about the revelations of her work for Azerbaijan, and her response was, Casey, what's your cholesterol count? Which I still don't know. I don't know why that's quite as relevant, but again, I'm a lot older now, so I should figure that out at some point. But one case study of many others that are out there.
Right. The last question, we're saving the hardest question for last. We have multiple questions about Israel's influence and AIPAC. Gene Ramsbottom asked, AIPAC foreign agent? Question mark. If so, registered. Go first.
Yeah, good. Glad we're saving the easy stuff for last. Look, I'm not an expert in AIPAC. I don't really write about them in the book that much. My understanding of AIPAC is that it's an American organization funded by Americans and American foundations, does not take foreign funding, does not take direction from foreign governments, in this case, Israel. And so, according to the letter of the law, would not have to register as a foreign agent. Now, all that being said, Ben, you and I have talked about plenty of loopholes within America's foreign lobbying oversight or foreign lobbying apparatus. One of those being using dark money networks, using workarounds for things like campaign funding, campaign finance, and again, using nonprofits that do not have to disclose foreign financing, or even using things like straw donors and straw organizations or shell companies as workarounds. The money, it's all fungible. Ben, I don't remember if it was from your work or someone else's, where you're talking about how these regimes give millions of dollars to foreign lobbyists or their firms, and then those lobbyists and firms in turn give millions of dollars directly to the individuals in Congress they are lobbying. Again, maybe they're not technically breaking any laws, but all of that money is fungible, and it is clear as day what those regimes are trying to do and what they want and the role that foreign lobbyists are playing. So again, maybe a disappointing response about a group like AIPAC, but I think it points to a whole host of other issues.
Yeah, to your point there, Casey, we've done that repeatedly. Whenever we do a country-specific report, we try to match up the money with the meetings. And what we in every report I believe I've ever done on this, we always find what we call same-day contributions, meaning that the same day a lobbyist meets with a member of Congress, they or somebody at their firm has made a campaign contribution to that member of Congress on the exact same day. They report meeting them on behalf of a foreign power. what we always have to, whenever we put this in a report or we write about one of these things, I think my readers are ready to get the pitchforks, and they're just clamoring about the illegality of this. And I always have to remind folks, whether we like it or not, it's perfectly legal. Because under FARA, where the foreign agents are reporting this information, it makes it clear that they're reporting that their campaign contributions are made from their own funds and under their own behalf. And if they're U.S. citizens, they're perfectly allowed to make campaign contributions within all of the relevant limitations and everything. And they can even make a contribution to a member of Congress on the exact same day they meet with them on behalf of a foreign government. We may really not like it, but it happens and it's perfectly legal.
The quote that comes to mind is, the scandal isn't what's illegal, the scandal is what is legal. I would say if folks want to read more about that, highly recommend the Foreign Policy Auction, which is available online. Has plenty more on that. Because again, these foreign lobbyists are many things, but they are not idiots. They know where the loopholes are, and they are more than happy to provide that and related advice to their dictator clients or other governments they work with and represent, all for their own benefit.
Casey, thank you so much for that comment. Shameless plug for the Foreign Policy Auction. To everybody, go out and buy Foreign Agents and American Kleptocracy too. Just wonderful, wonderful, informative books. We are at time, so Casey, I just want to take this time to thank you very much for sitting down with us. As much of a FARA nerd as I am, I always learn something new whenever I talk to you. So thank you very much for joining us.
Likewise, it's been an honor, and hopefully this brings more folks into our little neck of the woods, and keep the conversation and the research going.
I'm good. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.